going to take us through some overview, but then also get to thunder. And so we'll just kind of see where it goes. So let's just have a word of prayer, and then we'll start. So, all right, everybody, deep breath in and out. God, for the spirit that gives us breath each morning and the spirit that gives us rest each evening, we give you thanks. For the ways in which you have spoken and speak into the world, and for the ways that you continue to do that, we ask for your wisdom and your guidance, for your challenging, for all the ways in which you continue to let us grow into who you hope us to become. We thank you for this time and for Hal and for what he brings into this space, not just in knowledge, but in care and compassion and his understanding of community. We give you thanks this day. Let our conversations, our questions, all be faithful and wise and filled with good humor and curiosity. We thank you for the opportunity to gather in this space, and for those who allow us to be here, we give you thanks. We pray all this in the name of Christ, and all God's people say, Amen. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody, and Hal, you'll go ahead and mute yourself, and then I will put Hal on spot. Here we go. All right. All right, you're on.
Okay, thank you. Nice to be with you all again. And it's quite a wonderful chance to just grab Monday evenings for this kind of study. I know some of you have done a number of studies of extra-canonical texts, and some haven't. That's also a nice mix as far as I'm concerned. But just since last Monday was our first time together of thinking about, in this case, in that case, it was two particular extra-canonical texts. Let's start with simply any thoughts that you have from last week or any questions, and mainly just in terms of not particular specifics of information, but more, how was it for you to be in a territory that was not canonical heavy, but had a variety to it? Any things that you noticed about how it was for you to study extra-canonical texts? Now, just for the moment, stop and see whether something has happened in this last week that it'd be important to think about together.
And if you want to go to gallery view, you can see everybody. So then you can go ahead and raise your hand.
Yes, and I've actually got the participants. If you want to raise your hand electronically, I can call your name as well. Here, I'll go to gallery as well.
Oh, you're never quiet.
Yeah, I'll take a moment. Just, you all didn't know that I was going to ask you that question, so take a moment or two to see if there's some things that you want to say or things that you want to ask about the whole experience of extra-canonical studies. Let's see, someone. Okay, I've got Betty Howell.
Okay, and I have one sentence, Hal, for you. I think it's better than reading Paul.
Okay, good. Nice. That's a nice way to start. Other thoughts or questions about the general experience of extra-canonical study?
Betsy has her hand up.
Oh, Betsy, I'm sorry.
I was surprised with Levi. And if that's really the Matthew that wrote the book, the gospel, because I don't think of him as defending women. So
Yeah.
it gave me a different way to think about Matthew.
Yeah, I have not also seen him in that role beyond the Gospel of Mary. So that's new, I think, in general for all of us. And it's important to be asking those kind of questions. The other thing about Levi and Matthew is they're different traditions, and there are probably 2 or 3 Levi Matthews going on, and it's hard to know which is which.
Jim Hewlett had his hand.
Okay.
Jim, you're muted.
Is that it?
Yep, you're good.
The question I had is, the canonical gospels are gospels we've been with all our lives, and in the last 1,000 years or so. How do we draw a line? How do we determine what writings to take seriously enough to consider studying that are not canonical?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Now we're getting it going here. So as I alluded to last time, one of the big things that's happened basically in the 20th century and a little bit before is we discovered so many new texts. In other words, Christianity and church didn't have that question until the latter part of the 19th century, and then it just ballooned on us. So again, here, I guess I want to say, and you've heard a little bit of this from me before, I want to say it is overwhelming to know what to do with all of a sudden almost 150 new texts in the last century plus. And as we said last week, that happened because of this odd little mix in the 19th and 20th century, where European scholars started going to the Mediterranean and discovering all of these texts. So at first, what happened in the beginning of the 20th century is people just decided that it was too scary to have all these new texts. And basically we scholars acted as if it did not matter to have new texts. Now in the last part of the 20th century, and then especially the last 2 decades of the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we've had so much in the last 40 years chance to really study so many of them. It's now quite clear that a lot of them are worth studying more. And I don't know how much of you have had this experience, but of course, it is true that the canonical texts have grown stale for some people. And other canonical texts, as we alluded to last time, are not that good. So for instance, I want to say 1 Timothy is just doggerel of anti-woman position after position after position. So it's a real mess now. Or as is the case for me, I just think it's such a great play field to have a bunch of texts that are new and are quite powerful, and to notice that there's a relativity about the text we've been working with for so long. Let me say one thing, however. the 150 texts that we now have that are new in a little bit since the late 19th century, we just don't have enough scholarship to know the real answer to your question. That is, what's good and what's not. That's still in process. So, for instance, I had a number of students who did their PhDs with me just to become the first person who ever wrote a PhD on one of these texts. And that was in the 1990s and for about 15 years. So, for instance, no one has ever done a PhD at all on the prayer of thanksgiving that we looked at last time. So I want to say it's clear that there are a lot of very beautiful and wise new texts, but we still don't have an overview just because it is, even after 120, 30 years, we still haven't gotten to all of them. And the other thing I guess to say would be, so how long has it taken to get a good take on the canonical ones? There are texts still in the canonical Gospels that hardly anybody ever reads or thinks about. So it's still an in-process deal. And what I want to say now is that I frankly have dropped canonical distinctions, as you can tell, and what I tend to call this big mashup of texts is it's a large family of texts that are very the variety is not just between canonical and non-canonical, but the canonical and the non-canonical both have a lot of variety in them themselves. You really got me going there. So I'll stop. Any other first things to think about this evening? Yes, Evan.
I had what I think is a quick question. Do we have any idea of how many texts were candidates at the time that the canon began to be formed? And would that have been about 300 or where?
Yeah, and by the way, if any of you end up having a copy of a New Testament, there's a whole chapter about that. So basically, one of the main things that has emerged in the last 40 or 50 years is that it turns out that when I went to seminary, I was basically lied to about how the canon formed. And we're rethinking how the canon came to be quite a lot in the last several decades. So, for instance, there never was, for the first 1,000 years, there never was an ecumenical council that raised the question of what is in the New Testament. For the first 1,000 years, nobody decided that. It came gradually into being, but we really don't. We didn't have any Pope tell us what everybody was to read, nor any council. Nevertheless, let's stay with your question. The first thing that I remember is one of the great scholars of our times in this regard is Karen King at Harvard. And she says that she thinks that we have right now probably only about 15% of the writings that were written by the early Christ people. In other words, that's also weird, that we simply don't even have the majority of what people wrote.
I get chairs. Sue can sit here and I'll sit here. I'll get a chair.
So I would say that by about 500, there is a soft consensus about what people like, and that has mostly to do with when they started translating text from Greek to Latin. And so the first bunch of texts that are put together are the ones that are the new ones that people decide to translate into Latin for the European constituency. I think I feel like that my response is more yet more proof that we don't know. But those are as good as I get on that. Let me say a little bit more as we're going on. So we're going to go into, for much of tonight, we're going to go into the Thunder Perfect Mind. But I think this, before we do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about Nag Hammadi. How many of you, raise your hands, how many of you know what Nag Hammadi is? Nag Hammadi. Okay, I see one or two hands. So Nag Hammadi was probably the major discovery of the 20th century in terms of texts. Yeah, it's a great story. I won't tell it all, but it's a breathtaking story of in 1945, two farmers in Egypt, in central Egypt, were doing what farmers do along the Nile every year, and that is when after the Nile spills over in a regular fashion and then goes back in the banks, all farmers go out into the countryside and look for basically deposits of what might be fertilizer for their crops. So these two guys in 1945 are doing that, and they come upon a big jar that is sealed. Now, Egyptians, it's a big deal in rural Egypt when you find a big sealed jar. Because you know that could go all the way back to the pharaohs, right? You're still finding that kind of stuff along the Nile coming up. And these guys found this jar. They didn't know, they weren't sure whether they were going to open it. They basically were a little bit afraid because they were afraid a bad genie might be inside it. But then they decide they're going to break it open, and they were thinking that it would be good to open it up because it might be Pharaoh's gold or something like that. That happens to farmers, and they were very disappointed that there were only 52 ancient documents in it. They took it home to their house and left it outside. About 7 months later, their mom, it was kind of cold, and she said she wanted them to build a fire, and why couldn't they go out and why couldn't they get some of that papyrus and start a fire with it? And they did. So we lost some of them. But this was basically how these 52 documents, almost all of which were from early Christ communities, and about 2/3 of which we had never heard before. So for instance, tonight, what we're going to be studying, the Thunder Perfect Mind, that was clearly, or almost certainly, a writing. Is the only text we have of this. We don't have anything else of this basically poetry than what they found there. But then also, for instance, in the same jar, there was the Gospel of Thomas. Some of you may have read the Gospel of Thomas. It's one of the most popular. Or then there's the Gospel of Truth, and a whole slew of very interesting texts. It looks like the last 70 years of figuring them out, it looks like that jar came from a monastery that actually the remains of which were only 3 miles away from where they found the jar. And they think that the monastic folks, the monks, we know that there was a monastery in the 3rd century that had a library. We found those remains. And so they think that for some reason, somebody had to put a bunch of the library documents in a jar and hide it or take it somewhere. There are also caves up in there, and the caves it may have been that they were taking the jar up into the caves where some of the monks would go for contemplation. But at any rate, that's Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi is the name of the nearest village, the Egyptian name, current Egyptian name of a small village. So that's Nag Hammadi. And that is probably the most significant discovery of the last 500 years in terms of early Christ people's texts. So let me stop and see if you have any thoughts or additional questions or thoughts about Nag Hammadi. Well, we're going to jump right into it quite quickly. So some of your questions may not be just about thunder, but will be about the larger context of the Nag Hammadi discovery. Before we go and look at the text of Nag Hammadi, of Thunder Perfect Mind, let me tell you a little bit about the history in the 20th century of the Thunder Perfect Mind. It is almost certainly the second most praised document from Nag Hammadi. The Gospel of Thomas is probably the most well-known and praised, but the Thunder Perfect Mind is the next most. And the really fascinating thing about thunder is that it was not discovered by church people and not really by scholars in terms of it discovering that people wanted to write, to read it. It was discovered by artists. I mean, 20th and 21st century artists have written more about the Thunder Perfect Mind than either scholars or church people. And we can think about that quite a bit as we talk tonight. But a number of very famous artists have either written songs or novels or poems about the Thunder Perfect Mind. So that comes to us then in a funny 20th and 21st century discovery, in that basically people discovered it because we were talking about this last week. Elaine Pagels, in her very famous and very helpful book, The Gnostic Gospels, she quoted much of the Thunder Perfect Mind. And it was there that the artists found it and said, we've got to work with this. This is a very important text. So with that, let's then jump into the Thunder Perfect Mind. How many of you either raised your hand electronically or with a flash? Here, how many of you got a chance to read some parts of the Thunder Perfect Mind? Okay, we've got good readers. Man, this is better than most churches that get reading. Thank you. How many of you have not had a chance to read it? Okay, several. Good. Then you, if you can, bring your copy of the Thunder Perfect Mind out now. Do you have that available to you? I'd like to have us just out loud read some of it. And that would mean that I'd like you all to unmute, if you can, just for a little bit. And let's read it together, not in unison, but let's read like the first 9 verses, just one at a time. Anybody can read it. I'll read the first verse, and then whoever wants to reads the second, third, and fourth, and up to 9. I was sent out from power. I came to those pondering me, and I was found among those seeking me. Someone else?
Look at me, all you who contemplate me. Audience, hear me. Those expecting me, receive me.
Don't chase me from your sight. Okay. Don't let your voice or your hearing hate me.
Don't ignore me at any place. My time, be careful. Do not ignore me.
I am the first and the last. I am she who is honored and she who is mocked.
Okay. Anyone else want to read a little bit more?
I am the whore and the holy woman.
Let's keep on going. That's getting good.
I am the mother and I am he, the mother and the daughter. I am the limbs of my mother.
I am a sterile woman, and she has many children. I am she whose wedding is extravagant, and I didn't have a husband.
I am the midwife, and she who hasn't given birth. I am the comfort of my labor pains.
I am the bride and the bridegroom, and it is my husband who gave birth to me. I am my father's mother, my husband's sister, and he is my child.
Okay, let's stop there. That's probably enough to work on for a little bit. So let's just see, your immediate responses. Just one sentence. Just shout it out.
Contradictions.
Contradictory.
Paradox.
In a way.
What?
Dialectics.
Dialectic.
fullest expression I've heard.
Hmm. Good, thank you. Let's now, go ahead.
Succinct again.
She said the same thing. No,
Because we need to.
Frank said the same thing.
Okay, say something else.
So let's, just what we've heard so far, what do you notice about the kind of speech it is? Who is speaking?
All.
Yeah, everybody.
Everybody. That's a fascinating answer. That was not the question I was asking, but that's a great answer. I'm going to ask it again. Who is speaking?
It's a first person voice.
Yes, it's a first person singular voice, right? Mm-hmm. And here I want to say a little bit of scholarship. This is basically an ancient kind of speech that is fairly common in the ancient Mediterranean. There, the fancy word is eritology. That is basically a divine person speaking in the first person singular, who identifies her or himself by talking about her or himself. So in other words, this is, although the Thunder Perfect Mind, this particular eritology is only one, but you'll find this kind of talk in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean, very often. A divine figure saying who she or he is. Speaking of he and she, this I, is this I he or she? He?
I think it's a she.
Okay, let's have a vote on this. Hands raised for she. Hands raised for he. Okay, yeah. So I have written a book about thunder, and so I've studied it a lot. We can talk a lot about gender tonight. I hope we get to some really important gender conversation. But this is about, this I am is about 75%, maybe 85%, depending on how you're counting, female. There are only a few male I ams. Did anybody see a male I am in these first 9 verses? Somebody caught it. The person who read this caught it.
The 6th verse.
Yeah, read it again for me, would you?
I am the wife and the virgin. I am he, the mother and the daughter.
Right.
I am the limbs of my mother.
When I wrote the book about thunder. It's the only English book about thunder with 4 of my students at Union Theological Seminary. And when we found I am he, the mother, I quickly ran to my friend Karen King, who I knew had studied this before I had. And I said, have you seen I am he, the mother? And she had, the other previous scholars had assumed that that was just a grammar mistake. Mm-hmm. But what you'll notice is it isn't the case, because whoever of you read verse 9, you'll see that verse 9 says, I am the bride and the bridegroom, and it is my husband who gave birth to me.
Yeah.
So there is, I am he, the mother, right down, just 5 verses down from. So I think one of the very important things for us to talk about, and I'm gonna say a little bit about this and then ask you for your thoughts as a group for 10 or 15 minutes. So gender-wise, this is primarily then a female divinity. So this is an I am that identifies itself primarily as female. But there's a real strategy to this, some of which you all have been noting. This mainly female voice is very interested in putting things that are not the same in the same sentence. Some of you might say that they're opposites, but if you look carefully, they're sort of opposites, but they're mostly just differences. And often the differences come in 2 or 3 at a time. It's not just binary. So this is a female divinity primarily, which talks about all kinds of different feminineness or femaleness. So again, let's just remember this. I am she who is honored and she who is mocked. I am the whore and the holy woman. I am the wife and the virgin. I am he, the mother and the daughter. I am the limbs of my mother. I am a sterile woman and she has many children. I am she whose wedding is extravagant and I didn't have a husband. Notice here what this I am is doing with what it means to be female. It identifies contradictions within what it means to be female, or sometimes contradictions, but sometimes just huge differences that are either crazy making or wonderful. So for me, for instance, I really like the one, I am a sterile woman and she has many children. Now, the Coptic is sterile, and I frankly don't like the term sterile, but what you'll notice is that a number of the words for women by this female divinity use words that have been used against women. So for instance, the classic one is, I am the whore and the holy woman. And again, the Coptic is the whore. It's not some nice word for that. It's the word that insults the woman, put right alongside the whore and then the holy woman. So what we notice here is that the way the I am, the female I am, or the feminine I am, builds itself is through complex differences. I would want to say, I am a sterile woman and she has many children. I know that woman. And I bet you do too, right? Don't we know so many women who actually didn't give birth to children, but made children, and who were mothers for that? So in other words, I want to say this is attensive I am female, but it's actually very real. And it includes all kinds of powerful ways that women, or females are females, and insulting ways, all mixed up alongside of one another. The second thing that I would like to say, just to introduce, and frankly, I want to tell you that you can read this on gender fronts for a long time. I recommend it just taking it to bed for a year, because it's got a lot of nuance in terms of gender. But the other thing we need to notice is that there are, from time to time, there is maleness here. And again, let's just use for the first, for the time being, let's just use that one we saw first. I am he, the mother, and the daughter. So that most of this is female, a little bit of it is male. I want to, alongside of the mixing of the insulting and powerful and beautiful parts of what it means to be female, this is just gender bending all over the place. In other words, for me, this is one I want to suggest that this is one of the most powerfully gender bending texts I know. It doesn't even when it's primarily female, it doesn't stay steady. That genderedness has all kinds of difference in it and shift shapingness in it. Alongside of that, maleness and femaleness, not as binaries, but as overlapping genderedness are throughout the text itself. So that's a quick difference or a quick introduction to gender, and it's throughout the rest of the text as well. We'll probably be able to go on to it. But let me stop here and hear from you about your first responses, either to the first 9 verses, but since many of you have read the whole thing, what do you think about this genderedness? And I would want to say, especially gender bendedness. Yes, Vita.
One thing that struck me is that the first verses, really up to about 9, describe this divine being, and then beyond that, sort of the rest of chapter 1 is defining that person in terms of relationships.
Right, yes.
And that's a very feminine thing. Women are often, defined according to Mrs. So-and-so, rather than who they are. And then when you get to chapter 2, it gets more abstract. Silence, ideas, sounds. It goes away from the human. So that really struck me. So there.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's very true. And once we get into chapters 2 and 3, it continues to shapeshift in larger categories. Other things that some folks want to protest or talk about or ask about in terms of genderedness and gender bendedness. I'm looking at my little.
Betty Howell is raising her hand.
Oh, hi, Betty.
Hi. My comment is that it's been hard for me to see the he in here, because the only text that I've ever read that was remotely like this was in Proverbs and the wisdom parts of it. And that to me was always a feminine voice. And so I'm wondering, is there any, do you think that there's a relationship, or is this something that's a totally different style of writing from what we know from that?
Oh, thanks so much, Betty. You're right in my territory. So I have read, or I've written 2 books on Wisdom Sophia in in Proverbs. And so I want to say that not only I, but most scholars say thunder and wisdom Sophia in Proverbs is very similar. In fact, the Proverbs is full of erotologies. Wisdom Sophia herself speaks in the divine feminine. And by the way, when I co-wrote these two books on wisdom, as a Methodist, we were brought up on heresy charges because we said, look at the divine feminine in the Bible. And that was with the method. I'm a United Methodist. So yes, this is, but the thing that is very interesting and for me is that by and large, the wisdom literature is, you're right, is female throughout. So that it's not gender bended generally. And one of the biggest pieces of this kind of eritological I ams of a female divinity is Isis, the Egyptian goddess, and we're pretty sure that Isis and wisdom, the biblical wisdom figure, that they are related. Matter of fact, in some cases, we think that they may be overlapping in their writing. So thank you very much, Betty. That is right where a lot of the work with thunder has gone. Other people want to say some of their thoughts about the genderedness of thunder.
I see Oscar and Suchitra.
Okay.
Or Suchitra, why don't you go? You need to unmute.
And it's interesting. I'm not picking that up. Thank you.
They're just they're flailing their hands.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, good. They're flailing. Good.
This notion of divinity of women or women divine is something that reminds me very much of the literature I read in 1970s, the first feminist movement. I was in the feminist movement, very involved, and I remember that they brought up the idea of God being divine and feminine at the same time. And there were also literature written about that I'm forgetting because I read them in 1970s. But thank you so much for bringing up this point. It is so wonderful to hear this from a person like you, and thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, and I have loved this kind of literature from the ancient world a lot for a long time, and thunder itself has such a full character. We're going to see a lot of parts of her that I think, those 1970s years were really a ferment, weren't they?
Oh yeah.
Thank you. And then who else? Someone else was wanting to talk.
Yeah, I was not going to talk about the feminine issue, so if you want to pass me, that's fine.
No, I don't. No, just jump right in.
All right. What strikes me about this is that no one speaks but the singular voice. There's no exchange, no questions, no dialogue.
Right. Yeah.
And so it really sounds like a mystical statement, because there is no opportunity for people to say, well, what do you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and again, there I would want to say, so this is just a kind of thing that the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. That's the way a lot of gods and goddesses talked. They took up all the space. But what's really very interesting about thunder here is that she, with a single voice, represents so many different people. So, for instance, that's quite different than wisdom or Isis, because they have real tight, basically divine and monarchical characters. But whereas thunder wants to include like every kind of woman you ever thought, spoken in that one single voice. So she is one, but she is many in that regard. All right.
I see Don Fidler and then John Howell.
Okay, please.
You raised the question for me about the title, and you're referring to Thunder as if Thunder is the person who wrote this. But even as I've read through this today, I do not understand the title. And I wonder if that is the title that the author wrote, or if that's been added later.
Oh, welcome to the crowd, Don. That's really wonderful. Thank you for doing that, because I so presumptively started talking about thunder, and we have no clue. The word thunder does not appear in the text, as you may have noticed. Actually, mind does once, but that's no reason. So here's the I think I have the real answer, Don, and that is that the ancient writers did not give titles to their material. None of them did. So, for instance, I want to say my favorite gospel, the Gospel of Mark. That wasn't that title isn't in the text, and almost certainly was made up by a scribe who was copying it down. And so the scribes are, for instance, their job is to do a lot of writing, right? To copy a whole bunch of things. And so the copyists there, they needed to give the texts names so they wouldn't get them mixed up. And so I want to say that by and large, the entire Bible is not, the titles generally don't matter for anything. They're made up second or third hand. All the ancient texts, the writers neither care about the author being mentioned or they're having a title. So in other words, I have no clue what this title means, and neither do any colleagues that I know. So nice notice, Don. Okay, and then
John Howell.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to observe that this reminds me of Zen koans.
Say a little bit more, John.
Well, Zen koans often present paradoxes, and the goal is to somehow see past the paradox.
Beautiful.
I don't know whether that's part of the intention here, but the parallels seemed worth noting.
Oh, if you go deeper into thunder, you're exactly right there. In other words, this text is so fixed on difference and complexity. So yes, I think the comparison to the koan is just perfect. This has a little bit of a different rhythm than the koan does, but I think it's very, very much in that territory. Okay, if there's not another question or thought, I'm going to jump into the next.
Evan has his
Okay, good, Evan.
Evan is flailing about.
Okay.
Unmute.
Again,
Yeah, when were names attached to things like the Gospel of Mark? Were there names attached as early as, say, the 4th century or earlier?
Oh, well, so for instance, the first full text of Mark isn't until the 3rd century. And frankly, I can't remember the top of the first page of that. I'm pretty sure that does not have in its first. Most of the first manuscripts do not have titles. They grow with titles as they get later. And hardly any of these texts, canonical or non-canonical, we have hardly any of them in a full book until the 3rd or 4th century. Okay, so let's look at one of the other really powerful dimensions of thunder, which I think does not. We can think gender-wise about this as well, but I want us to look at a couple of other dimensions, and I'm going to, just because we're already an hour into this and haven't got to this, I'll just read it out loud to you. Do not be arrogant to me when I am thrown down to the ground. You will find me among the expected. Do not stare at me in the shit pile, leaving me discarded. You will find me in the kingdoms. Do not stare at me when I am thrown out among the condemned. Do not laugh at me in the lowest places. Do not throw me down among those slaughtered viciously. I myself am compassionate and I am cruel. Watch out. Do not hate my compliance and do not love my restraint. In my weakness, do not strip me bare. Do not be afraid of my power. I am she who exists in all fears and in trembling boldness. Now, here, what we notice about thunder is that even though we know that she is a divinity, she's divine, she's getting beaten up all the time. So she's being thrown to the ground, they're making fun of her, they're yelling at her. Of the I ams that she has, almost half of them are about her being humiliated. You know, the first thing we heard from her about who she is I am the first and the last. That is straight from, among other people, Jesus in the Revelation to John. But here we have a character who is in trouble and hurt and traumatized a lot in her expression. It's not that she's just that, because she often will assert her power, but her power is not nearly complete. And in fact, she is very vulnerable throughout the entire text. This is very strange in the ancient world. All of the great I ams in the ancient world, inside the Bible and outside the Bible, by and large, most of those I ams are the great I ams, and they never have any problem with someone throwing them to the ground. So for instance, we were talking about the figure of wisdom in Proverbs. Wisdom is completely powerful, and she is not in any way afraid of anything. But here is a divinity that is humiliated and vulnerable and powerful. For me, the only other place that I know in the ancient world of a great I am talking about who he or she is and being vulnerable is Jesus in the Gospel of John. As you may know, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is always saying, I am this and I am that. I am the good shepherd. I am the vine and you are the branches. 12 different times Jesus says, I am, only in the Gospel of John. But Jesus is also crucified in the Gospel of John. So for me, the only two ancient divinities that pronounce themselves as greatly divine, but who are in trouble and who are getting thrown to the ground is the Gospel of John and the Thunder Perfect Mind. So I'd love to hear you all work with me a little bit on what would that mean to have a divinity that is both powerful and vulnerable and thrown to the ground and all of these other things that happen. Yes, slaughtered viciously. Yes, Evan.
Yes, my question during most of this has been, what makes this book Christian? And you have just suggested one thing that might make it Christian.
Yeah, hold on to that thought. That's I think that's a very important question. But let me actually stay with your question a little bit too. So the word Christian is by and large not used until the 3rd century. The word Christian occurs only 3 times in the New Testament. And those 3 different times that the word Christian is used is don't have the same meaning. In other words, we can't figure out what Christian means in the New Testament because it's only used 3 times. Jesus, by the way, is mentioned 1,003 times in the New Testament. So Jesus is clearly real in the New Testament. Christian is simply basically not there for the first 2 centuries. That may not be the only thing you want to say about what you meant. In other words, there are Christ groups in the first 2 centuries. It's just that hardly any of them think that they're Christian. And they talk a lot about Jesus, but in different ways. So nevertheless, your question is really powerful and very helpful in that you looked through it and you didn't find Jesus, right?
Right.
And that of course is true of several books in the New Testament as well. But it's really important that we have such a powerful identifier in this book of Thunder, but one wants to know whether it's Christian or at least Christ related would be maybe a better way of putting that. So here's the main answer by my colleagues. I'm not sure if I agree with them or not on this, but 47 of the 52 books found in the jar are clearly Christ related or Jesus related. In other words, they were almost, it's probable that all of the 52 texts in the jar came from the monastic library. So that I don't think is a good enough answer to your question, because the one of the others that doesn't mention Christ in the Thunder Perfect or in the Nag Hammadi, there's a partial copy of Plato's Republic in that same jar. So thanks for that. Let's stay with this figure that is thrown to the ground, slaughtered viciously in the shit pile, and powerful, and standing as a no-nonsense female power. What do you make of that?
Seeing Vito raise her hand, and then
Okay,
Donnell.
please.
Okay, and this may be not quite on topic, but when I read this passage, I couldn't help but thinking how, with this shutdown and all the pandemic, we are finding out who is really important. You know, and they're people that we didn't expect to be important. They're farm workers. They are people in the front lines. They're people who are caring for people in nursing homes. They're all sorts of jobs and positions that are not considered to be, you know, a lawyer or a, you know, the things that get renown in our society. But yes, they are the ones that hold society together.
Yeah,
That's what it said to me.
Vita, I think you're right on target. In that, if you read through Thunder, all of the many different characters that she is, most of them are not big shots. Yeah, very much so. How does it make you all feel to relate to a divinity who is so vulnerable?
Hope, did you flash up your hand? And John, I saw your hand earlier too. Why don't we go Hope and then John?
Yes, I did. I find that I'm taking a somewhat different kind of way of seeing this, and maybe not different, but the part of me is rejecting the piecemeal way in which we're addressing it, although I understand the necessity for it and the usefulness of it. But what has drawn me mostly to it is the totality, the oneness of the whole piece that has many, many different factions and parts and opposites and mixed up. But that to me is the beauty of it, is the totality. And because it just speaks so to me of the absolute fullness of that which is, or the all, or the fullness of God, or something that shouldn't be broken down, but should be seen as a total piece, because there's something that's just very, very awesome to me about witnessing that.
Hope, just hang into that. You're exactly where the majority of Thunder readers are. I think that is so important. And I certainly see us building towards that by noticing all of the different characters that is all in the same voice. And similarly, for me, it's not at all strange that that's a very Jesus-like voice when you look at the other texts, because that is the vulnerableness of the Jesus character as well. But this text it wants everything to be included, but it is not from the top down. In other words, I would want to say, yes, stay with that, but there are if you would read Isis, she is regal, and her oneness is always from above. This is a wholeness, I think you're right, that is so diverse and so claiming those who are vulnerable as well. I really love, for me, that that comes out. I am she who exists in all fears and in trembling boldness.
Mhm.
Thanks so much. And I think we had another.
Yeah, John Howell, go for it.
At least in the second chapter, I can read the I as being truth. And truth is sometimes not believed, and it's sometimes thrown into the shit pile. But you still should pay attention to it. So I don't see the voices saying I am wounded, but rather people think they wounded me because they ignore me and try to destroy me.
I think that's in there as well. Yes. Yes. You're not Margaret, but you're sitting next to Margaret. But you also need to unmute.
Thank you. A couple of points. The power of this kind of a divinity is that people can embody that sense and have a divine relationship within themselves in no matter what adverse circumstance they might find themselves. That's what that identity creates. And the other thing I was wondering is that the people who wrote this, or the author, could they have been writing an allegory about Jesus?
Well, of course, we can't tell for sure, but the fact that the monks got a hold of it, I would say, points towards that. In other words, either it was written thinking about Jesus, which I know other texts that clearly are thinking about Jesus but never mention Jesus. So there are a lot of those kind of texts, both in and outside the New Testament. Or the other thing that other people have said is that even if this is a different kind of more vulnerable Isis, the monks grabbed a hold of it and said, no, this really helps us think about Jesus.
I saw Dawn. Dawn, did you still have a question?
Might be naive, but it occurred to me, was this intended to be performed?
Well, my book on Thunder has an entire chapter on performance.
Good. When do we get to that?
Yeah, right.
I just looked it up, Hal. It's like $100 on Amazon.
It is, yeah. Yeah.
We like you, but
yeah, no, and I'm not trying to sell it. One of my main publishers is Palgrave Macmillan, and they only make their money from the libraries. So I can tell you that the Thunder is in all the libraries, but basically it is so frustrating as an author that Palgrave Macmillan only wants to sell to libraries because that's where they make their money. I have 4 Paul Gray McMillan books, and all of them cost $100.
I see Martha. Martha, your hand is raised. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, in chapter 4, verse 32, it does say, "Hear me, audience, and learn from my words, you who know me." So, and I think there was one other reference to audience.
Yes, the very first verse. Or no, it's the 3rd verse. Audience, hear me.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
expecting me, receive me.
So I was kind
Yeah.
of thinking this Greek tragedy, or not a tragedy, but
very-
there's a big audience in an amphitheater, that this person is speaking to.
Yeah, I think so. But I think for me, I think that thunder was performed regularly by large groups, and anybody could jump in. In other words, I would want to say that in relationship to what Hope was saying, this is a multiplicity with one voice. And so the way I imagine it is that the group of 10, 15, or 200 get together and they just shout out who they are. And they know that they are one in their participation in this kind of divinity. Performance, again, the other thing that is much more mundane than what I was trying to just say, almost all of the biblical texts were primarily performed. See, because hardly anybody knew how to read or write in that time. So under 10% of everybody is reading or writing. So, and when someone learns to read in the ancient world, that they know that the reason they're learning is for everybody else who can't. So for instance, when we've got these great documents that teach you how to read and write, and they say, whenever you're reading, you have to be reading out loud. So no one reads silently in that era, because they are always practicing. Even if they're alone and practicing their reading, they're doing it out loud because that's why you read, is as a group. It's not a single occupation. Okay, so unfortunately for me, since well, wait a minute. I was just going to say how much I love thunder, but Bruce, you said this was a favorite of yours. Would you tell us a little bit about
why?
Yeah, why, or what matters?
I mean, this is no shock to this community. I think the expansive nature of the holy and the divine that it just communicates is right in my theological wheelhouse, and kind of what we, I think, as a community and I try to push out is this expansive understanding of who God is, not a narrowing, but a broadening. And so I love, one of my favorite phrases is, many things can be true at the same time. And that just throughout this, it's like, yes, these things are true at the same time in us, in the holy. I mean, I this is one of those that I read it the first time, and I had never heard of it before. And when I first read it, I was probably, out of everything, was moved the most out of all the ones that the council had to read, by far. But the expansive nature of the holy is just comes through so strongly. I fell in love with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Other things that anybody, before we leave, I'm going to say a couple words about next week, but let's give anybody a chance to say a last word. Evan.
In what you were saying a while ago about being God being cast down, it reminded me, of course, as you pointed out, parallels in John, but also I think it's in Acts in Peter's sermon or elsewhere in an epistle, the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all over the place. That's in, and Paul, for instance, is always saying about he himself is always being beaten up.
I'm sorry.
Get that off.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You should have done that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about next week, which I jumped and talked about for a moment last week. So we're going to look at the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And it's pretty long text, and it's a story. It probably should be called the Acts of Thecla. Now, Thecla is the name of a woman, and the longer story that you will read is that Thecla is a young teenager at the beginning of the story who runs across Paul in her city, and she starts listening to Paul. And Paul's main, in this text, Paul's main message is anti-marriage and encouraging young people to leave their families, married or even just as children, and to reject family as a viable way to love God. And she, Thecla, leaves her family and leaves her the man that she's to marry right on the spot, and that puts her and Paul into great trouble. And so you'll see the story unfold in which, because she has rejected her family and she has followed Paul to figure out how to belong to a different kind of family than the natural family, or natural is probably the wrong, than the normal family. And so this is a text that was one of the most favorite of the 2nd century, because there were a lot of young people leaving family to try to find a more loving and compassionate family that would be a chosen family rather than a blood family. Thecla really Thecla was never lost. So this is one of the texts that didn't need to be found because it was so popular throughout almost all of Christianity. This will help us think about not only what family might mean or not mean, but this will help us think about much more about gender, because Thecla, as we'll see, Thecla actually cuts her hair off and dresses like men, so she will be accepted in the public. And so she will be accepted as a teacher and a healer. So quite a story. It's, for me, really fun to think about, think with this text, because it has been so powerful for so long, mostly in Catholic Christianity, frankly, but more and more in the last 100 years in all kinds of Christianity. So that's what I wish I had 3 more Mondays with you all, but maybe we'll have other chances to be together. But we'll go to Thecla next.
All right. Thank you, Hal. Thank you. Again, this is recorded. It will we'll post it probably tomorrow. By the end of tomorrow, we'll have it up on YouTube. Sarah, did you have a question? I saw your hand pop up. No. Okay. And then I think that's it. So we'll see you next week for our final one. And again, thank you all for coming. And we'll see you whenever we see you next. All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Hal. All right.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Hal.